When I first started exploring New York, I thought I knew what to expect: crowded streets, bright lights, noise, and energy everywhere. But the deeper I went, the more I realized there are places here that feel like they don't belong to the world everyone sees. Hidden corners where the air grows still, the silence feels heavier, and stories cling to the walls like shadows. These are the sides of New York no one talks about, the strange, isolated places that make you stop and question what really happened there. And once you see them, you can't forget them. If you love exploring the unexplained and uncovering hidden secrets, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join me on every adventure. 1. Bannerman Castle, Polypel Island, New York. When I first stepped off the small ferry and felt the wooden dock of Polypel Island under my feet, I realized how strangely quiet the place was. The Hudson River was alive behind me, soft waves, distant motorboats, but the island itself felt separated from everything, as if time had decided to stop here years ago. Bannerman Castle stood above me like a broken monument, its crumbling walls catching the late afternoon light, giving it a haunted kind of beauty that pictures never really show. I walked up the narrow path that twisted between overgrown bushes and rusted railings. Every few steps, small pieces of stone lay scattered on the ground, almost like the castle was shedding parts of its history. The wind pushed through the broken windows, making a deep hollow sound that echoed inside the empty structure. For a moment, I genuinely felt like someone was standing just beyond the shadows, watching me, not in a supernatural way, but in that heavy, historical way where places feel aware of the people who visit them. As I got closer, I ran my hand along the cold stone wall. It felt rough, almost sharp, as if it had been untouched for decades. I tried imagining how this island must have looked when Francis Bannerman built this strange fortress-like warehouse more than a century ago. The idea of someone choosing an isolated river island to store old military weapons and equipment seemed insane, yet standing here, it somehow made sense. The castle wasn't built to impress, it was built to hide. Inside, everything smelled like damp stone and old wood. Sunlight entered through holes in the roof, landing on twisted metal bars, collapsed beams, and piles of fallen bricks. Each room felt different, one filled with eerie silence, another with strange echoes, another with sudden cold air that rushed past me as if something had moved quickly behind me. Every time I turned around, there was nothing, just long, empty hallways and cracks running through the walls. I paused near a broken archway where vines had swallowed almost half the structure. I stood there quietly, listening. The river sounded far away now, and the wind carried little whispers through the ruined rooms. I don't know why, but in that moment, I felt a strange sadness, like the place wanted to be remembered, not just photographed and abandoned. Before leaving, I sat on a large stone near the edge of the island. Across the water, modern life continued, cars on the highway, distant train horns, city noise. But here on the island, everything felt frozen, untouched, forgotten on purpose. It's strange how a place can feel empty and alive at the same time, but Bannerman Castle has that effect. When the ferry finally returned, I looked back at the castle one last time. The sun was almost gone, and the castle appeared darker, more mysterious than before. And honestly, it felt like I was leaving someone behind, not a ghost or a legend, but a story that still wanted to be told. 2. Big Indian Valley, Catskill Mountains, New York. I still remember. The first time I drove toward Big Indian Valley. The farther I went into the Catskill Mountains, the more it felt like the rest of New York was disappearing behind me. The road narrowed, the trees grew taller, and the silence slowly replaced every sound I was used to hearing. It didn't feel like a normal forest. It felt like the kind of place that keeps its own secrets and doesn't care who steps inside. When I finally parked near a small clearing, the air was colder than it should have been. It wasn't even evening yet, but the sunlight had trouble getting through the thick branches hanging above me. I walked slowly, trying to follow an old hiking trail, but the path kept shifting like it didn't want to be remembered. The ground was soft, covered with layers of leaves that had probably been there for years. Each step made a dull sound that disappeared almost instantly, like the forest was swallowing every noise I made. After a few minutes, I felt something I can't explain, like someone was standing somewhere behind the trees, not watching me exactly, but just present. I kept turning around, expecting to see an animal or maybe another hiker, but there was nothing. Just endless trees, thick shadows, and that strange feeling that I wasn't truly alone. As I walked deeper into the valley, the trail suddenly dropped into a quiet, open space. It was beautiful, but unsettling in a way I couldn't put into words. The place felt untouched, almost too untouched, like no one had walked there in years. The wind moved slowly through the leaves, but there wasn't a single bird call, not even the sound of running water. A forest without sound is the kind of silence that sits heavy on your chest. I decided to rest on a fallen log. Sitting there, I realized how isolated this part of New York really was. Most people think of the city, noise, crowds, lights, but here, none of that existed. Here, the world felt older, stranger, and slightly unpredictable. Even the air had a different smell. Like wet earth mixed with something metallic that I couldn't identify. At one point, I heard a sudden crack from somewhere behind me, sharp enough to make me stand up instantly. My heart jumped, and for a second, I felt a wave of fear rise inside me. But again, when I turned, there was only the forest. Still, quiet, almost too calm. When I finally decided to head back, the sun was lowering behind the mountains, and long shadows stretched across the ground. I walked faster than before, not because anything was chasing me, but because the place had a strange way of making you feel small. Like the valley didn't mind if someone got lost inside it. By the time I reached my car, the silence felt even heavier. I sat for a few moments, looking back at the tree line. Big Indian Valley isn't haunted in the traditional sense. It's haunted in the way nature can be, vast, isolated, and powerful enough to remind you that you're just a visitor, and the forest decides how long you get to stay. 3. Love Canal, Niagara Falls, New York. I still remember the strange heaviness I felt the first time I stepped into what used to be the Love Canal neighborhood. Even before I walked down the empty streets, the air already felt different, quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful, but hollow, like something important had been taken away years ago and never replaced. The houses stood in rows, but most of them looked empty, frozen, and slightly tilted, as if time pushed them but never fully knocked them down. As I walked closer, I could hear the gravel crunching under my shoes. That sound echoed far louder than it should have, because there was nothing else. No kids playing, no cars, no open windows, just long, silent blocks that once held hundreds of lives. I paused near a chain-linked fence, the kind that tries to hide something rather than protect it. Beyond it were open patches of land where whole streets once existed, now replaced with uneven grass and strange dips in the ground that didn't look natural. I stood there wondering what it must have been like when families suddenly had to leave everything behind. It's one thing to read about toxic waste buried beneath a neighborhood, it's another thing to stand on the same soil and feel a quiet warning rise in your chest. The ground didn't feel dangerous in a physical way, but emotionally, it felt unsettling, as if the earth itself remembered every mistake that happened here. I continued walking until I reached a small, abandoned driveway. On one side, a cracked sidewalk ran along a half-standing utility pole that still had old flyers stapled to it. The edges were faded, and the paper crumbled when I touched it. That moment hit me harder than anything else. People once lived here so normally that they stapled things, lost pets, garage sales, community meetings, right where I was standing. Now there wasn't even a whisper of them left. As I stepped farther into the neighborhood, I smelled something faint in the air, a mix of mud and chemicals, so light you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. But once I noticed it, it stayed in my senses. I tried brushing it off as old soil, but something deeper kept pulling my thoughts back to what really happened here. At one point, I stopped in the middle of a cul-de-sac. The pavement was broken in a circular pattern, almost like the ground had been slowly sinking for years. I bent down to look closely, and for a moment, I felt this strange pressure in the air. Not fear exactly, but a tightness, like the place was reminding me that people didn't leave because they wanted to, they left because staying meant slowly being poisoned by something they couldn't see. As the sun started dropping behind the trees, the abandoned houses cast long shadows across the empty road. It looked peaceful, almost beautiful from a distance, but the closer I looked, the more I felt the weight of the past. It was the kind of quiet that makes you suddenly aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, your own footsteps. Before leaving, I looked back at the neighborhood one last time. The daylight was almost gone, and everything felt still, too still. And in that moment, I understood why Love Canal is remembered the way it is. Not as a ghost story, not as a mystery, but as a place where real people lived, suffered, and walked away, leaving behind streets that still carry their memories in the cracks of the pavement. And even as I got into my car, that faint chemical smell stayed with me, reminding me that some places aren't abandoned because time forgot them, but because they never let anyone truly forget what happened there. 4. Plum Island, Suffolk County, New York. The first time I approached Plum Island, I felt a strange mix of curiosity and tension that I couldn't shake off. Even before the island came into full view, something about the atmosphere felt controlled, like every wave, every gust of wind, and every bird flying nearby was being watched. The boat I was on moved slowly, cutting through the water with a quiet hum, and the closer we got, the more real the isolation felt. Plum Island looked peaceful from a distance, but as we approached, that peace took on a different meaning, like a place that didn't want visitors, or maybe wasn't supposed to have them at all. When my feet touched the dock, the silence was the first thing that hit me. There was no sound of people working, no engines, no voices, just the sound of the water tapping against the wood. The island felt big and empty at the same time, the kind of place where you feel exposed even when no one is around. I walked slowly, taking in the sight of old structures, fenced areas, and long empty roads that stretched into places you weren't allowed to go. The signs were everywhere: restricted zones, authorized personnel only, no entry. Even though I wasn't going near the research facilities, just seeing those signs made me feel like I had stepped into a place that preferred to stay hidden. The air smelled different too, clean, but with a faint chemical sharpness that drifted in and out depending on the wind. I followed a narrow path that led toward the shoreline. On one side, I could see a cluster of abandoned-looking buildings, paint peeling, windows hazy with salt, doors shut tight. They looked like they had been left alone for years, untouched by storms, untouched by time, almost like someone had locked them and walked away without a second thought. I paused near one and ran my fingers across the rough wall. It felt colder than it should have been, even under the sun. The strangest part was how empty the island felt. Not abandoned, not deserted, just deliberately quiet. Too quiet. There were moments when I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing except the long stretch of road. At another point, I heard a metal door slam from somewhere far off, even though I didn't see anyone who could have closed it. I walked toward a small beach area where the sand was untouched, no footprints, no tire marks, nothing. I sat down on a smooth rock and stared at the water. From that spot, the mainland felt close enough to touch, yet the island felt like another world. A world with secrets. A world that wanted you to look but not understand. As the sun started sinking, long shadows stretched across the island, making everything look even more distant. The wind picked up and carried a low, humming sound from somewhere behind the restricted fences. I don't know what caused it, but it made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't threatening, but it wasn't natural either. On the boat ride back, I looked over my shoulder and watched Plum Island shrink into the horizon. Even from the water, it had a presence, silent, heavy, and mysterious. And the strange part is, the farther I got from it, the more I wanted to look back. Not because of fear, but because the island felt like it still had things to say. Secrets that didn't leave with me. Even now, when I think about it, I can still feel that same quiet tension in my chest. Plum Island isn't just isolated, it's the kind of place that stays with you long after you leave. 5. Huguenot Street, New Paltz, New York. I remember the first morning I walked down Huguenot Street, and even now, that moment sits in my memory like a photograph. The air was cool, colder than I expected for early fall, and the street was so quiet that I could hear my own footsteps tapping against the uneven stones. The houses stood in 2 long rows, each one older than anything I had ever seen in my life. They didn't feel abandoned, but they didn't feel fully alive either, more like they were watching, waiting, holding centuries of moments inside their walls. As I walked farther, I felt something strange settle into my chest, a mix of curiosity, respect, and an uneasy awareness that I was standing on land that had witnessed far more than anyone alive today could describe. The buildings looked strong, but the wood was darkened with age, and the tiny windows looked like tired eyes. I kept imagining the families that had lived inside, the voices that used to echo in the rooms, the everyday routines that once filled the place with warmth. I stopped in front of the oldest stone house. The morning sun hit its walls at a sharp angle, making the texture stand out. I reached out and touched the stone. It was colder than the air, almost icy, and for a second I felt a small shiver run through me, not fear, but a sudden awareness of how old this place truly was. It's one thing to read about history. It's something else entirely to feel it underneath your fingertips. As I walked, a faint smell of wood smoke drifted through the air. There was no fire, no chimney smoke anywhere, yet the scent was clear, warm, familiar, as if someone had lit a fire hours earlier and the last traces were still hanging around. I looked around, trying to see if anyone else had noticed it, but the street was empty. Completely empty. It made the moment feel unreal, like the past was brushing against the present for just a second. I decided to cut through a narrow path between 2 houses. The ground dipped slightly, and the trees overhead tangled into a dark canopy. I stood still because I suddenly heard the faintest sound, soft footsteps behind me. The rhythm wasn't fast, just steady, almost cautious. I turned around expecting to see someone, but the path was empty. The sound stopped the moment I moved. For a minute, I stood there trying to convince myself it was just the leaves shifting. But the leaves weren't moving. The air was still. I walked out of the path and back onto the main street. The sunlight felt comforting again, but my heartbeat hadn't fully slowed. Something about that moment stayed with me as I wandered toward the small burial ground at the end of the street. The headstones were worn, some names barely readable. Standing there, with the afternoon light stretching across the grass, I felt a heaviness, like the stories of the people buried there were right at the edge of being heard if I was quiet enough. Before I left, I turned around and looked at the entire street one more time. The houses stood still, lined up like guardians of a time long gone. The silence felt different now, not empty but full of footsteps, conversations, fires burning in old hearths, and lives lived long before me. Walking away, I realized something: Huguenot Street doesn't feel haunted by ghosts. It's haunted by memory, thick, layered, and impossible to ignore once you've stood there long enough. Even now, I can still feel it, like a gentle pull reminding me that some places don't just preserve history, they live in it.